but the fact of the matter is that people are limited to 8 bits, and we have heard of some cases where people are already within their own confines of usage, have been using them in a way such that they've become somewhat limited. So, despite the fact that the working group felt that 256 unique product identifications would be acceptable for most manufacturers, given anticipated product lifecycle rollover and the reuse of these things. It's come to our attention that perhaps a word of advice would be to guard these and use them carefully, manage the issuing of these carefully. So how does one go about doing that? Well, one of the things that you can do is, although it's not mandated by RFFE today, just about every device manufacturer needs to keep track of versions of a product or versions of their technology that they've used. So there is freedom to assign that, and actually the working group would recommend that you not use the product ID space to manage the tracking of those versions or variants, as the case may be. Also, it's recommended not to use the product ID as a means to identify different versions of the same device, different instantiations within a given platform of the same device. There's another entity within command sequences and the addressability of devices called the USID, which I'll talk about in a moment. And that's the better and intended mechanism for this. Further, it's a little bit more work, but there's even an implied example in the spec where a manufacturer can actually reuse product IDs for different device types. If you happen to be fielding both a PA, for instance, and an antenna switch module, you can actually reuse the same product ID because you're going to more than likely be using a different USID. So again, it factors in with this USID. Now this requires some careful analysis and thought as well, but it does help to preserve the product ID space. So in general, RFFE leaves a lot of flexibility in this area, but a general recommendation would be, again, to be careful with the issuance of the product IDs. Perhaps even to consider whether you need to track actually unique products or perhaps just instantiations of the RFFE interface. That might be another way to use it, and then use another proprietary register to actually track different product types that are using that same interface. So, but in closing on this topic, I would just say that the RFFE working group is looking at means and steps to perhaps expand this space in the next generation or a next generation of RFFE. So, on to another topic, the USIDs, as I mentioned, which is the individual RFFE devices on a given bus are identified by what's called USIDs, which are unique slave identifiers. There is a suggestion for default USIDs for devices within the spec, and it seems to generally be being used, although it was intended just as a useful guideline. So variations from this are acceptable, but using the suggested ranges for different device types, as shown here, allows devices to usually be in the ballpark of what an end platform is going to desire. But it's not hard to see, especially given the fact that you may have multiple instantiations or multiple copies of your device present on a platform, that some conflicts could occur within those USIDs. One means that RFFE takes to address this is an optional inclusion by slave manufacturers to actually offer the ability to reprogram a USID from its default value to one that's used until the device is reset. And this is easily done. What's used to differentiate a device is as long as either the USID, the product ID, or the manufacturer ID are unique, then the USID can be reprogrammed to another value apart from what its default is. So given two different devices from two different manufacturers who chose the same default, it's not a problem, because one of those fields, one of those values is going to be different. So there are actually two methods in the spec for altering the programmable USID. They're both similar in that they use the same fields, but one of them takes advantage of the extended addressing capability, or the extended register write capability. However, despite that, there is still the problem that can occur when there are multiple devices from the same manufacturer of the same type, and so the desire would be for them to have the same product ID. And if they both have the same default USID, then it's difficult to differentiate them at power-up, at initialization, in order to be able to uniquely address them, to tell one of them to be a different address. There are ways around it. It involves a cost in either pins or a masking difference on the parts, which is another way to do it. Fuses and NVRAM would be another possibility if the technology supports it. But all of those things are not necessarily available in the wide range of technologies that people want to use to implement RFFE slave devices in particular. So there's not a guarantee that somebody may not run into this problem. It's not an easy problem to solve universally, particularly at no cost. And further, it's not something that's unique to RFFE. This is a problem that's experienced with other interface standards as well. Nonetheless, it's one that the RFFE group continues to work to address.